Becoming Steve Jobs. There's a lot of books about Steve Jobs, his life, his trials, tribulations, some talking about how great of an innovator he was, others talking about how big of an asshole he was. But Steve Jobs, nevertheless, is a very interesting man who certainly changed the face of the technology industry, whether directly or through innovation at Apple or Pixar. There's a lot of books about him. One I want to talk about is Becoming Steve Jobs. It's a long book, but it's one that I found to be the best so far. So this book is long. It covers a lot of different things. There's a big picture view of Steve Jobs' life, but it also shows his evolution from early on in his life, from the original time at Apple to when he was fired, and how he evolved and became a better leader after that when he was at Pixar and when he returned to Apple in 1997. You see that transition. This book is great because it had a lot of different anecdotes, a lot of interviews from people that actually knew him. Of course, you have stories that we've already heard before. For instance, you of course hear about the infamous deal that went on at Atari when Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak did some work for Atari, and Steve lied about how much money they were compensated for that project. But there's also unique stories that I personally have not heard before. For instance, there's a story in the book about Steve and his wife and kids driving to the Stanford campus to give the now infamous, or I should say famous, graduation speech. The story, in a very quick sense, involves them driving and forgetting their parking pass and talking to a security guard to try to let them in. And the security guard doesn't know who they are, and Steve's wife is trying to tell the security guard, hey, this is the commencement speaker, and the security guard is just like, no, you can't be the speaker. So it's a very interesting book. What I like about it, though, is that I already know a lot about Apple. I'm a technology enthusiast. I own a lot of Apple products, so I know a lot about Apple, but I did not know nearly as much about Pixar, and I love Pixar, and I love their movies. So it was great to hear and learn about Pixar. You learn about Lasseter and Catmull, who were from the beginning huge players at Pixar. And you learn that even though Steve gave them a lot of feedback, he never tried to overstep his bounds. He knew he was not an expert in that field. So when people asked for criticism, constructive criticism, he offered it, but he didn't overstep and try to dictate the direction of these films. I think that's just really pretty interesting. Another thing that was just interesting, apparently Steve really, really loved working at Pixar. He would go once a week and be there on Fridays. And it was interesting to just hear that people who needed to talk to Steve about certain things would try to schedule meetings on Fridays when he was at Pixar because they knew he was going to be in a better mood. That's just something interesting that I did not know before. Like I said, there's a lot of books about Steve Jobs, but the fact that I'm still learning something new by listening to this book is just something that's really interesting and great about it. I think the other thing that I really like about this particular book is that it was written by a journalist who actually knew Steve. He had a personal relationship with him. He covered him for Fortune during the period at which Steve was at Apple and then at Next and then back at Apple. They would have friendly phone calls and interviews. They'd have dinner together. It's just something that's really great because it's not some biographer coming in and trying to lecture you on something he has no personal experience from. This is legitimate first-hand accounting. It also has, like I said earlier, direct anecdotes from Jobs, his wife, Bill Gates, other Apple execs. And actually, this is one of the only books that Apple execs have endorsed. Eddie Q tweeted that this was an excellent and fair account of Steve Jobs' life, and that's something that we haven't really seen with previous movies, documentaries, and books about Steve Jobs' life. So again, this is Becoming Steve Jobs, and it's a fantastic book and audiobook that you should definitely check out. If you enjoyed this video, please remember to click subscribe below to stay up to date on the latest and greatest videos from my channel.